In the quiet countryside of southern Georgia, where the red clay clings to your boots and the cicadas hum like a lullaby, there lived a man most folks just called Farmer. He wasn't flashy. He didn't own a fancy truck or wear designer clothes. What he did have was a worn-out pair of overalls, hands rough from years of honest work, and a smile that came slow but always reached his eyes. Every morning before the sun even thought about rising, he'd be out in his fields, checking on his rows of okra, sweet potatoes, and collard greens. His farm wasn't big by any stretch, just 40 acres tucked between pine trees and a slow-moving creek. But to him, it was everything. It was peace. It was purpose. And after everything he'd been through, that peace meant more than gold. People in the nearby town knew him as the quiet black man who always had extra squash to share or a jug of sweet tea ready if you stopped by. He'd wave from his porch, ask how your mama was doing, and never say a bad word about anyone. Some assumed he'd always lived this way, born and raised in the country, never seen much beyond the county line. But that wasn't the truth, not even close. Years ago, long before the farm, before the overalls and the slow drawl, he'd worn a different uniform, one that carried weight far beyond fabric. He'd been part of an elite group few ever see and even fewer understand, the U.S. Navy SEALs. For 14 years, he'd operated in shadows most people only hear about in movies, jumping into black waters at midnight, moving through jungles with nothing but a knife and a radio, making split-second decisions that meant life or death. He'd seen things that stayed with him, carried losses that never fully healed, and earned honors he never talked about. But after his wife passed, suddenly, from an illness that moved faster than anyone expected, he couldn't stay in that world anymore. The noise, the pace, the constant readiness, it all felt hollow without her. So he walked away, not with fanfare, not with a parade, but quietly. He sold his condo near the base, packed what little mattered, and drove south until the roads got narrow and the air smelled like earth and rain. He bought the old Henderson place for a song, fixed up the sagging porch, and started planting. Now at 52, he carried more weight than he used to, both on his frame and in his step. A limp from an old injury flared up when the weather turned cold, and his knees creaked like an old gate when he knelt to pull weeds. But none of that slowed him down. He moved with a kind of quiet strength, like an oak tree that's weathered decades of storms but still stands tall. Kids in the neighborhood sometimes dared each other to knock on his door, expecting a grumpy hermit. Instead, they'd find him offering homemade peach cobbler or showing them how to tell when a watermelon was ripe by thumping it just right. He never asked for thanks. He just believed in doing right by people, the way his grandmother taught him back in Alabama. What no one knew, not the post office clerk, not the church deacons, not even the sheriff who'd known him for 10 years, was that beneath the calm exterior lived a man trained to survive anything. He didn't carry that past like a badge. He buried it deep like seeds waiting for the right season. He hoped he'd never need it again. He spent his evenings on the porch swing, watching fireflies blink over the fields, listening to the wind rustle through the corn. Sometimes he'd stare at the stars and think about all the places he'd been, the deserts, the mountains, the oceans, but none of them ever felt like home the way this patch of Georgia dirt did. Here he wasn't a warrior. He was just a man who grew food, fixed fences, and believed in second chances. And for a long time, that was enough. Life on the farm followed a rhythm. Plant, tend, harvest, rest, repeat. He liked the predictability, the honesty of it. If you worked hard, the land gave back. If you were careless, it showed you right away. There were no hidden agendas in the soil, just truth, sun, and time. He'd built a small life that fit him like a well-worn glove. He fed his chickens at dawn, checked his irrigation lines by mid-morning, and took a long walk through the back pasture every afternoon, just to clear his head. On Sundays, he'd drive into town for church, not because he was overly religious, but because he liked the singing and the way folks looked out for each other in that little brick building. Neighbors would stop by to borrow a tool or ask advice about blight on their tomatoes. He never turned anyone away. Once, when young Billy Thompson's tractor broke down during planting season, he spent 2 nights helping him rebuild the carburetor, refusing any payment except a jar of Billy's wife's blackberry jam. That was the kind of man he was. But peace, as he knew better than most, is fragile. It started small, so small most people wouldn't have noticed. A set of unfamiliar tire tracks near the south fence line. A cigarette butt stamped into the dirt by the old barn, something he never smoked. Then came the late-night engine sounds, too far off to identify but close enough to feel wrong. He didn't say anything, just watched, listened, remembered how to be still. He'd learned long ago that trouble rarely announces itself with a shout. It creeps in quiet, testing boundaries, seeing what it can get away with. And this felt like testing. Still, he hoped it was nothing. Maybe just kids joyriding, or hunters passing through. He gave the benefit of the doubt because that's what good neighbors do. But deep down, in a place he hadn't visited in years, something stirred. Not fear, not anger, just awareness. The kind that comes from knowing how the world really works. He kept working his fields during the day, smiling at passers-by, sharing his harvest. But at night he started walking the perimeter again, not with a flashlight but with his eyes adjusted to the dark, ears tuned to every rustle in the brush. He checked the locks twice. He made sure his phone was charged. And though he hadn't touched it in a decade, he remembered exactly where he'd buried the metal box under the tool shed. For now he waited. Because sometimes, the best way to protect your peace is to act like you don't know it's being threatened. Things started getting strange in the late spring when the days stretched long and the air turned thick with humidity. At first it was easy to brush off, just odd little things that didn't quite fit. A gate left open that he knew he'd latched, a few of his chickens acting spooked for no reason. Then came the footprints near the back fence, too big to be a kid's, too careless to belong to someone who lived out here. He didn't say much about it. Folks around these parts minded their own business unless something serious happened, and he wasn't about to start rumors over a few muddy shoes. But he kept his eyes open. He always had. Then one Tuesday morning he found his truck tires slashed. Not just one. Both front tires, cut clean through like someone took their time doing it. He stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, breathing slow. No anger, just calculation. He'd seen this kind of thing before, not on a farm, but in places where people used fear to control others. It was a message. "We can reach you." He called the local sheriff's office. The deputy who showed up was young, polite, but clearly out of his depth. Took a few notes, snapped some photos, said they'd look into it. But his eyes kept drifting toward the house like he expected trouble to jump out from behind the porch swing. Before he left, he muttered, "You sure you don't got any enemies, sir?" The farmer just smiled and said, "Only the ones who don't like fresh collards." But inside he knew better. This wasn't random. Someone had been watching, and now they were pushing. A week later, he came out at dawn to water his seedlings and found spray-painted words on the side of his old red barn, "Sell or suffer." The letters were sloppy, angry, dripping like fresh blood in the morning light. His stomach tightened, but his hand stayed steady. He didn't call the sheriff this time. What good would it do? They couldn't guard his land 24 hours a day, and he wasn't about to ask for help he knew wouldn't come. Instead, he grabbed a bucket, some soap, and a stiff brush. Washed it off himself before the neighbors could see it. Didn't want folks worrying or worse, gossiping. This was his problem to handle. But that night, after the sun went down and the frogs started their chorus, he sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee listening. The countryside wasn't silent, not really. There were crickets, owls, the occasional dog barking miles away. But tonight something felt off. Too quiet in certain patches, like someone was holding their breath. He'd heard rumors lately. Whispers at the feed store about a group from the city moving into the abandoned farms down near Cypress Creek. They weren't farmers. They didn't care about crops or soil. They were using the empty barns and overgrown fields as hiding spots, for drugs, maybe stolen goods, maybe worse. And now they wanted his land, not to grow anything, just to use it. He got an offer a few days later. A man in a too-clean suit showed up in a black SUV that looked wildly out of place on his dirt driveway. Said he represented a development group interested in buying rural properties. Offered him double what the land was worth. Cash, no questions. The farmer listened politely, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the man's face. He saw the way the guy's fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel. Saw the two others sitting in the back seat watching the house like hawks. This wasn't a real estate deal. It was a threat wrapped in a business suit. He declined with a calm, "I'm not selling," and walked back inside without another word. He didn't slam the door, didn't raise his voice. But the message was clear. 2 nights later, they left a dead crow on his doorstep. Not just dead posed. Wings spread, head twisted backward. A warning from old superstition: you're being watched. You're marked. That's when he knew talking wouldn't work anymore. Still, he didn't panic. Panic got good people killed. Instead, he went back to basics. He checked every window, reinforced the locks on the barn, and started sleeping with a heavy flashlight by his bed. Not because he was scared, but because he remembered how darkness could be used against you. He also began walking his property at odd hours, not in a pattern. Never the same route twice. He studied the land like it was a battlefield again. Because, in a way, it was. He noticed things others might miss. A broken branch where no wind had blown. A patch of flattened grass near the creek. The faint smell of cheap cologne near the tool shed. They were testing him, seeing how he'd react, waiting for him to run. But running wasn't in his nature. What they didn't know, what no one in this quiet county knew, was that the man they thought was just a soft, overweight farmer had once moved through enemy territory with nothing but a knife and his wits. He'd been trained to stay calm when everything around him was chaos, to read people with a glance, to turn weakness into advantage. And right now they thought his size, his age, his quiet ways were weaknesses. Big mistake. He started making small changes. Left his truck parked crooked near the road like he was careless. Let a few weeds grow tall near the fence. Perfect cover for someone watching. Played the part of the harmless old man so well. Even his closest neighbors started wondering if he was getting too slow for this life. But behind closed doors, he was sharper than ever. He dug out an old pair of boots from the back of his closet. Sturdy, quiet-souled, the kind that didn't crunch on gravel. He oiled a folding knife he hadn't touched in years. And late one night, when the moon was thin and the clouds hung low, he walked to the far edge of his property and buried a small motion sensor camera near the tree line, just in case. He wasn't looking for a fight. Never had been, but if one came to his home, to the only place that had given him peace after years of noise and loss, he wouldn't back down. Because this farm wasn't just dirt and crops. It was his promise to himself, to the memory of his wife, to the life he'd chosen. And nobody, not some city gang thinking the country was easy pickings, was going to take that from him without learning a hard lesson. He sat on the porch again that night, sipping tea, watching the stars. The air was still, peaceful. But beneath that calm surface, something old had woken up. Not rage, not vengeance, just readiness. And somewhere out in the dark, the watchers had no idea what they were really dealing with. The breaking point came on a night so hot the air felt like wet wool. Crickets screamed, frogs croaked from the creek, and not a single breeze dared stir the leaves. He'd just finished feeding the chickens and was wiping his hands on a rag when he saw it, the back door slightly ajar. He always latched it. Always. His stomach dropped, but his feet didn't move. Not yet. He stood still for a full minute, listening. Then he heard it, muffled voices inside. Low, rough laughing like they owned the place. His jaw tightened, but his breathing stayed slow, steady. He didn't run. Didn't shout. Just backed away quietly like a shadow slipping into the dark. From the edge of the cornfield, he watched through the kitchen window as 2 figures moved around his home. One kicked over a chair. The other flipped open drawers in the old hutch where he kept his wife's recipe cards. They weren't looking for money. They were making a mess, sending a message. This is ours now. He felt a cold calm settle over him, the kind that only comes when you've faced real danger before and know exactly what it feels like. This wasn't fear. This was focus. When they finally left, slamming the door behind them like they expected him to come running, he waited another 10 minutes. Then he stepped inside. The place smelled like sweat and cheap cologne. Drawers hung open. His favorite coffee mug, chipped on the rim, the one his wife gave him on their 10th anniversary, lay shattered on the floor. And on the kitchen table, right where he'd eat breakfast every morning, sat a folded piece of paper. He opened it slowly. Just 3 words scrawled in thick marker. Be gone by Friday. Below it, a crude drawing of a grave. Most folks would have packed up that night, called the sheriff, maybe even fled to a motel in the next county. But he wasn't most folks. And this wasn't just a house. It was the last place he'd built something good after years of carrying ghosts. That night, after cleaning up the mess without a word, he walked out to the tool shed. Behind a loose board near the back wall, he knelt and dug into the soft earth with his bare hands. A few inches down, his fingers hit metal. He pulled out a small rust-speckled box, sealed tight, untouched for over a decade. Inside lay his old dog tags, cold to the touch. A folding combat knife, still sharp, and a compact pistol wrapped in oiled cloth, loaded but safe. He didn't take it out to use, not yet. He just held it for a moment, feeling the weight, remembering the discipline it represented. Then he tucked it back, closed the box, and buried it again. But this time, closer to the house, he didn't plan to shoot anyone. Violence was a last resort, and he knew that better than anyone. But he also knew that sometimes just being ready was enough to change the odds. The next morning, he acted like nothing happened. Fed the goats, watered the tomatoes, even waved at the mail carrier like always. But beneath the routine, everything had shifted. He started waking at 4 a.m., not because he couldn't sleep, but because his body remembered the rhythm of readiness. He'd walk the perimeter in the dark, barefoot at first, learning every dip and root in the ground. Then he'd do push-ups on the porch, slow and controlled, rebuilding strength he hadn't needed in years. His knees groaned, his back ached, but he kept going. Not to become a soldier again, but to protect what he had now. He installed motion sensor lights along the fence line disguised as old lanterns, strung thin fishing line between trees near the driveway, just high enough to trip someone running, low enough to stay hidden. And he set up a second camera near the barn, this one pointed right at the road. But the biggest change was inside him. The gentle farmer was still there, still shared squash with neighbors, still smiled at kids on bikes, but his eyes held something new. A quiet alertness, like a sleeping dog that's heard a strange sound in the night. He also started talking just a little, not about threats or gangs, but about unwanted visitors. He mentioned it casually to the feed store owner, to the gas station clerk, even to the young deputy who'd come out weeks ago. He didn't ask for help, just made sure people knew something was off. Because if things went south, he wanted witnesses. He wanted the truth to be known. By Wednesday, he'd lost 5 pounds. Not from stress, from movement, from purpose. His overalls fit looser. His steps were quicker. And when he stood at the edge of his field at sunset scanning the tree line, he didn't look like a man waiting to be pushed out. He looked like a man ready to stand his ground. Friday was coming. He knew they'd be back, probably with more people, probably louder. They thought he was alone, soft, easy to scare. They didn't know he'd spent years learning how to fight in the dark, how to use silence as a weapon, how to turn a peaceful place into a trap for the careless. But he wouldn't start the fight. He'd let them bring it to him. And when they did, they'd find out that the quietest man in the county was also the most dangerous one to underestimate. That night, he sat on the porch again, sipping sweet tea, watching the fireflies blink over the rows of corn. The farm was quiet, peaceful, but beneath the calm, something old had returned. Not the warrior exactly, but the protector. And protectors don't run, they hold the line. He didn't pray for violence. He prayed for peace, but if peace had to be defended, he was ready. Because this land wasn't just dirt. It was dignity. It was memory. It was the last good thing he had, and no one was taking it without earning a lesson they'd never forget. Friday night came in thick and heavy, the kind of dark that swallows sound and swelters under a moonless sky. Crickets had gone quiet. Even the frogs seemed to hold their breath. He sat on the porch in his rocking chair, wearing the same old overalls, sipping plain water from a mason jar. No lights on inside, no radio playing. To anyone watching from the road, he looked like just a tired farmer waiting for bedtime, but his eyes never stopped moving. He'd known they'd come. Not if when. And sure enough, just after 10, headlights cut through the trees at the end of the driveway. A beat-up pickup rolled in slow, tires crunching gravel like it owned the place. 3 figures stepped out. 2 big, 1 wiry, dressed in dark clothes, talking loud like they weren't afraid of being heard. They carried bats, one had a tire iron slung over his shoulder. No guns, at least not that he could see. Maybe they thought they wouldn't need them. Maybe they thought he'd be asleep. Or gone. They didn't see him watching from the shadows of the porch roof. Didn't notice the way his hand rested near the edge of the chair, ready. They walked straight to the front door, laughing, shoving each other like it was a joke. One kicked the door hard, once, twice before trying the knob. Locked. That's when their voices turned sharp. "Where is he?" One growled, "Old man better not be playing games." That's when he made his move, but not the way they expected. Instead of confronting them head-on, he stayed silent, letting them get comfortable in their arrogance. While they argued about breaking a window, he slipped off the porch and moved like smoke through the side garden, bare feet silent on the damp earth. He'd spent days studying their likely approach. Now he used it against them. First, he disabled their truck. Not with noise, just a quick twist of wire under the hood, something that wouldn't be obvious until they tried to start it. Then he circled back, staying low behind the corn rows, using the tall stalks like cover. He remembered how to move without sound, how to control his breathing, how to become part of the night. One of them wandered toward the barn, flashlight sweeping the ground. That's when the motion sensor light above the chicken coop flared on, bright, sudden, blinding. The man yelped, shielding his eyes. In that split second of confusion, a thin fishing line strung ankle-high between two fence posts did its job. He tripped hard, landing face first in the dirt with a grunt. Before he could get up, a firm knee pressed into his back and a calm voice said, "Don't move." The other two spun around, shouting, swinging their bats wildly. But the yard was full of shadows now, and every bush, every tree looked like it could hide someone. They couldn't tell where the voice came from, or how many people were out there. He didn't hurt the first one, just kept him pinned. Zip-tied his wrists with a plastic tie he'd tucked in his pocket days ago. Then he stepped back into the dark again. Panic set in fast. One of the others ran toward the truck, only to find it dead. He cursed, kicked the tire, then turned back toward the house, eyes wide. That's when he stepped on a loose board near the tool shed, the one rigged to creak loud under weight. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. The man froze. From behind a stack of hay bales, a low voice said, "Drop the bat." He dropped it. No shouting, no threats, just quiet control. That's what unnerved them more than anything. This wasn't some scared old man flailing in fear. This was precision, discipline, and they had no idea how to fight it. The last one tried to bolt into the woods. But the farmer knew every root, every ditch, every patch of mud on this land. He cut him off near the creek, not with force, but by simply standing in his path, calm, steady, blocking the way like a tree that wouldn't budge. "Please, man," the kid stammered. Younger than the others, maybe early 20s. "We didn't mean nothing. Just told to scare you." He looked at him, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. "Scare me?" he said softly. "You picked the wrong farm for that." He didn't hit him, didn't yell, just took his phone, pulled out the battery, and walked him back to the barn where the other two sat on overturned buckets, zip-tied and silent. By the time the sheriff's cruiser rolled up 20 minutes later, called anonymously from a payphone 10 miles away, the whole thing was over. No shots fired, no blood spilled, just 3 shaken men sitting in the cool night air surrounded by chickens and the smell of earth. The deputies stepped out, flashlights sweeping the yard. They saw the farmer standing near the porch, arms crossed, looking like he'd just come in from checking on his crops. "What happened here?" the older deputy asked, eyeing the tied-up men. "Says they got lost," he replied, voice mild. "Tripped over some fence wire, couldn't get their truck started. Asked if I could call y'all." The deputies exchanged a look. They knew better. They'd heard the rumors, seen the way this man moved, too calm, too aware. One of them had served overseas himself. He gave a small nod, like he understood without needing words. They loaded the 3 into the back of the cruiser without much fuss. As they drove off, taillights fading into the dark, the farmer went back inside. He swept up the broken glass from the earlier break-in, wiped down the table, and put on a pot of coffee. He didn't feel proud, didn't feel victorious, just tired and relieved because he hadn't wanted to fight. But he'd been ready, and that made all the difference. The next morning, word spread fast. Not through gossip, but through quiet respect. Folks didn't ask for details. They just nodded when they saw him at the store or left extra eggs on his porch just because. The gang never came back. In fact, folks said they cleared out of the whole county within a week. And the farmer? He went back to his rows of okra and sweet potatoes, back to his porch swing and his evening tea. But now, when kids walked past, they didn't dare knock on his door for a dare. They waved respectfully. And he always waved back with the same gentle smile, the same calm eyes, because peace wasn't the absence of trouble. It was knowing you could face it and still choose kindness afterward. Life settled back into rhythm after that night. Not the same rhythm as before, but something deeper, quieter, like the land itself had taken a breath and decided to stand a little taller. The farmer went back to his rows of collards and sweet potatoes, back to feeding the chickens at dawn and fixing fence posts in the afternoon heat. But things had changed in ways only the closest neighbors could feel. People looked at him differently, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet respect, like they'd glimpsed something true beneath the surface and didn't need to say it out loud. He never talked about what happened. Never gave interviews or posted anything online. When folks asked, he'd just shrug and say, "They got turned around is all." But word traveled anyway, not as gossip, but as story, the kind passed over coffee at the feed store or whispered during church potlucks. "You hear about what happened out at the old Henderson place?" someone might say, and the other would nod slowly, like they understood more than they were saying. What surprised him most wasn't the attention. It was the trust. People started stopping by not just to borrow tools but to talk. A young father struggling to keep his own small plot going asked for advice on crop rotation. A teenager who'd been skipping school showed up one Saturday morning and mumbled, "Heard you could use help with the goats." He didn't ask questions, just handed the boy a bucket and said, "Start with the water." Over time, that boy came back every weekend. Then others joined. Kids with restless energy, folks looking for a second chance. Even a few veterans who'd heard rumors and just wanted to work in silence beside someone who understood what it meant to carry heavy things quietly. He never called it a program, never made it official, but without meaning to, he'd started something real. A place where people could learn to grow food, yes, but also learn to grow themselves. He taught them how to read the soil, how to tell when a plant was thirsty, how to fix a broken plow with scrap metal and patience. But more than that, he showed them what it meant to stand your ground without hatred, to protect what's yours without losing your kindness. The farm became a kind of anchor for the whole area. When storms knocked out power, he'd fire up his old generator and let neighbors charge phones or keep medicine cold. When drought hit, he shared his well water without being asked. And every Sunday afternoon, rain or shine, he'd set out a long table under the pecan trees with whatever was fresh from the field. Fried okra, stewed tomatoes, cornbread, and anyone who showed up was welcome to eat. No speeches, no preaching. Just good food, quiet company, and the kind of peace that comes from honest work. Years passed. His hair turned more gray than black, and his limp got a little stiffer in the winter. But he still rose before sunrise, still walked the land like it was a sacred thing. And though he never confirmed the stories about his past, the truth didn't need saying. It lived in the way he moved, calm, sure, never rushed. In the way strangers' dogs would come right up to him, wagging their tails like they knew he was safe. In the way kids who once feared his quiet now ran to him with skinned knees, knowing he'd clean them up without a word of judgment. One spring, the local paper did a small feature on unsung heroes of the county. They wanted to write about him. He said no at first, but when they promised not to mention the incident with the gang, just focus on the farm and the community work, he finally agreed on one condition: no photos of his face. So the article ran with a picture of his hands, rough, dirt under the nails, holding a ripe tomato, and the headline read, "The Man Who Grows More Than Crops." After that, more people came, not to gawk but to learn. He started letting high school groups visit, teaching them about sustainable farming, about how food connects people across generations. He even partnered with a local nonprofit to turn a corner of his land into a teaching garden for at-risk youth. He didn't call it therapy. He just called it working the earth. And in that work, something healed, not just in them, but in him too. He'd come to this farm running from pain, looking for silence, but over time he realized silence wasn't the answer. Connection was, purpose was, growing something good in a world that often felt broken. He never left the farm again. Not for long, anyway. Took day trips to the hardware store, maybe a drive to see the ocean once a year just to feel the salt air on his face. But home was always the red clay, the creak of the porch swing, the smell of rain on dry soil. And on most evenings, you'd find him there, sitting in the same chair, watching the fireflies rise over the fields, listening to the wind move through the corn like a lullaby. Sometimes a neighbor would join him and they'd sit in comfortable silence, sharing a glass of sweet tea. No need for big words. The land said enough. He knew he wouldn't be here forever. But that was okay. because what he'd built wouldn't end with him. The kids he'd taught would keep planting. The table under the pecan trees would still be set. And the story of the quiet farmer who stood his ground, not with rage, but with roots, would live on in the way people looked out for each other in that little corner of Georgia. He wasn't a hero in the flashy sense. Never wanted to be, but in a world that often rewards noise, he chose stillness. In a time that glorifies walking away, he chose to stay, and to build something worth protecting. And sometimes, late at night when the stars were bright and the crickets sang their endless song, he'd smile to himself, not because he'd won a fight, but because he'd finally found peace. And helped others find it too.